Okay, welcome to week 2, lesson 4. Today we're going to talk about converting to from standard form to slope y-intercept form. So what does that mean? The form that we're most used to of an equation of a line is y equals mx plus b. So that's the form we like the most because that form, it's easiest to find the equation in. It's the easiest to graph it with because the b is our y-intercept, right? So remember how we would plot that on our graph? So we would go to 0 over b up or down, whatever b is. So if that was a 5, 0, 5. If that's a negative 7, 0, negative 7. And the m is our slope. So slope, and this is our y-intercept. So that's why they call it slope y-intercept form. And remember with graphing with slope, the slope is rise over run, so you can go up, down, and then over to the right. If it's positive, you go up. Negative to the, positive, you go up. Negative, you go down, and always moving to the right. Okay, so that's our best and favorite version in grade 9 of a straight line. But you can rearrange the equation into different forms. And right now you might be thinking, well, what's the point of that? If this is the best form, let's just always use it. The other form of a line, there's others, but the next most popular one is called standard form. And this is really big when you get into grade 10 and you start working with a bunch of equations of a line at once, even in grade 11, grade 12, and university math. So as I was saying, standard form is really important for different, doing some different math. So let's look at the differences between the two. So the one we know, again, is this guy here, slope y-intercept form. That's what we call y equals mx plus b. So anytime you're doing any of the homework this week, any of the assigned work, and it says something about slope y-intercept form, it's talking about the one you're used to, y equals mx plus b. So like it says, this is the most common way of writing linear equations. And how do we know it's in slope y-intercept form? Well, the y, the output variable, which is y, is isolated all by itself on one side. So that right there tells you it's in this form. So our goal, keep this in mind when we're doing this today, our goal is to isolate that y. We want to get it alone. So our goal is we're going to be converting from standard form to slope y-intercept form. So we'll just point that out right away because that's going to be our big goal today. And let's look at the other form of an equation, which is called standard form. All right, standard form looks like this. ax plus by plus c equals 0. And notice they're using capital A, capital B, capital C. So the b in standard form here is not the same as this b here. And I know how that can be confusing. I didn't make up all the rules of why we use this letter and why we use that letter, but those are the standard letters that are used in every textbook all over the place, okay? So they're not the same A, B, and C, they're different. So these are just numbers. A, B, and C here are just integers, okay? They're just numbers. Just like M and B over here are also just numbers, okay? So there's a couple rules. A is supposed to be positive and A, B, C are supposed to be integers to be in standard form. We're not supposed to have fractions. But the good news is in this, we don't need to work with it in standard form. What you're just going to need to do is get it out of standard form and into y equals mx plus b form, okay? So like I said, this form is commonly used when we're doing algebraic work with a system of equations, which means when we're working with a bunch of equations because we can line them all up nice and do, you'll see as you move through math, do something called a matrix with it and do some different math with it. But for now, let's not get too ahead of ourselves, okay? We just need to convert out of this form. Now, the problem with this form is we can't identify the slope and y-intercept right away, right? You look at it, you're not going to know what the slope is, you're not going to know what the y-intercept is. All right, so let's talk about how we convert. So I'm just going to move this down here, and we are going to convert a few of these here. Okay, so here we go. I got 4 equations I want to convert from standard form. They're all in standard form, and I want to put them into slope y-intercept form. Now keep this in mind. Every question you encounter from now on, if it's not in y equals mx plus b form, if it's not in this form, the first thing you need to do every single time is convert it to this form, okay? And a lot of questions after we get through this week aren't going to say that. You're going to just run into equations all the time that are in standard form, and you want to convert them to y equals mx plus b form. So it's actually pretty easy. There's only 2 steps. So before you do that, let's identify what a, b, and c are. So a is the number in front of the x. So in this case, a would be 1. B is the number in front of y, so another invisible 1. And c would be the number that's not attached to the x and y. So that right there is the c, is negative 5. All right, so I'm just going to erase all this stuff. Now, at most, the good news is there's only 2 steps at most. Sometimes only 1, but no more than 2 steps. So let's look at step 1 here. Step 1, isolate the term containing the y to one side of the equation. So that would be this here, the y. So what we want to do is just leave that there and move the other two terms off of this side. So we want to get them to the other side. So what we're really doing is the opposite operation, right? We're not really moving them, we're adding or subtracting, doing the opposite. So I'm going to leave the y on this side. Here's my equal sign. Now to get rid of this x from this side, the opposite would be to subtract x, because that's a positive x. So I got negative x. To move the negative y off of this side to the other side, I have to do the opposite, which is add 5. So again, it does look like we just moved it to the other side and changed the sign. All right, so this one's in y equals mx plus b. How do I know? Well, let me write down below here y equals mx plus b. Look, it's in the form. What's m? M is the number in front of the x. Well, that's a negative 1. We don't see the 1, but it's invisible. What's b? It's positive 5. There you go. Now, if you graphed it, remember, the y-intercept would be 0, 5. So the slope is negative 1. And again, if I was graphing this, the slope would be negative 1 over 1. So the rise would be negative 1, and the run would be positive 1. Go down 1 and go over 1. So if I wanted to graph this, I'd start at 0, 5, and then I'd go down 1 to the right 1, down 1 to the right 1. Or you can make a table of values if you prefer that method. Okay, so that one was pretty easy, and you might think, well, I don't really need to convert it. I can just figure it out by looking at it, but we have to be a little more careful. That was only one step. Let's do one that has 2 steps. All right, so we want to get step 1, isolate the term containing the y to one side. So there's the term that has the y. Let's leave that alone. 2y, and let's move the x, so we have to do the opposite, subtract the x, so it's a negative x, and subtract the positive 6, so it's a negative 6. Now, that's step 1. Look at step 2 here. Step 2, divide all terms by the coefficient of y. To be in y equals mx plus b form, we want it to be 1y, but right here we have 2y. So to get rid of that 2, we have to divide that by 2. But if we divide that by 2, we have to divide everything by 2. So all the terms have to be divided by 2. Now when we divide these, they cancel out, so we're just left with y. Now don't forget, there's a negative 1 in front of this x here. So the slope out front would be negative 1/2 x, and negative 6 divided by negative 2, that does divide, so we're going to make it negative 3. Now like I said in the previous lessons, I want you to write everything as a fraction if it doesn't reduce. So the 6 divided by 2 does reduce. Make that a 3 right there. But the negative 1/2, don't write that as negative 0.5. Write it as negative 1/2. Okay, so that means, again, I'm going to write y equals mx plus b below so we can compare. There we go. Y equals mx plus b. So m is my slope. It's negative 1/2. And b is negative 3. So there you go. We've converted it, and we know what the slope is and what the y-intercept is. So again, my slope, if it's negative 1/2, if I needed to graph this, the rise is go down 1 over 2, and I would start at 0, negative 3. Now, it's important to find the slope and the y-intercept, but it's also important to find the final equation. So I'm going to highlight here. This is the final equation for the first one, written in y equals mx plus b form. This is the final equation, written in y equals mx plus b form. And there you go. It only took 2 steps for the second one. 1 step for the first one, 2 for the second. Oh, and I forgot to write what a, b, and c were above. All right, so a is the number in front of the x, which is 1. B is the number in front of the y, which is 2. And c is the other number, which is 6. Don't get too worried about a, b, and c. We just want to identify them right now. And our main thing is to get it into y equals mx plus b form. Check. And what is the slope? What's the y-intercept? Make sure we know how to graph that. All right, let's do 2 more. The next one, what's a? It's the number in front of the x, which is 9. What's b? The number in front of the y, which is negative 3. And what's the c? The number that's not in front of the x and y. All right, now 2 steps. Step 1, isolate the y term. Now it's a negative 3y. So basically just leave that alone on the side of the equation, and we're going to move the 9x off the side by subtracting 9x, and we're going to move the negative 18 by doing the opposite by adding 18. All right, now that's step 1. Step 2, we need to isolate the y by getting rid of its coefficient, by dividing by whatever that number is. So it's a negative 3, divide by negative 3. Divide each term by negative 3, and let's simplify it. I get y equals negative divided by negative is positive. 9 divided by 3 is 3. Don't forget these negative 3's cancel out. Positive by negative is negative. 18 divided by 3 is 6. So I did it. I'm going to highlight. That's my answer. I want to find the equation in y equals mx plus b form. It's a really important skill. All right, and it takes 2 steps at most. So if we write y equals mx plus b, what's the m, what's the b? Well, the m is 3. The b is negative 6. So if I'm going to graph this, I would start at 0, negative 6, because that's my y-intercept. and I would use my slope. Now my slope is 3, which means 3 over 1. So I would go, it's positive, up 3, that's my rise, and to the right 1. And I'd repeat that to find more points. All right, last one. Okay, this one's a little tricky. The a is the number in front of the x, which is 19. The b is the number in front of y, which is a -1. And the c, there's nothing there, so it's 0. All right, so let's isolate the y. So that would be the negative y. Don't forget that negative. Everyone always forgets it, and then all of a sudden magically becomes positive. That's a negative y. If we move the 19x off the side by subtracting 19x, and that's all there is to move. Now I'm going to divide both sides by the coefficient of y, which is -1. So I divide this side by -1 and this side by -1. Now, again, there's an invisible 1 there. So those cancel out. -1 divided by -1 cancels, and it's just y. Negative 19x divided by -1 is positive 19x. Okay, so if we write y equals mx plus b, I'm just going to write that underneath. So that's our final answer. This equation converted to standard form is just y equals 19x. Now, what is m? M is the slope. That's the number in front of the x, so that would be 19. What's the b? There's nothing here. That's like having an invisible plus 0. Now, we don't want that in our final answer. We just need to know there's nothing there, so it's 0. Now, if I had to graph this thing, this might be a little trickier to graph on a small graph, but the y-intercept is 0, 0. And my slope is 19, which is 19 over 1. So it's positive, not negative like the first two, so I'm going to go up. And the run would be 1. I'd go over 1. So each time I graph this, I'd start at 0, 0 right here, and I'd go up 19 over 1, up 19 over 1, and I draw my line. All right. So that concludes our first lesson. Oh, no, it doesn't. There's one more example I want to do. Sorry. Okay, here we go with the final example of lesson 1. Here's an equation. This is what we need to be able to do this week. I'm giving you an equation, and I'm not even telling you to convert it. All I'm saying is graph this equation. Tell me the slope, tell me the y-intercept, and graph it. So you need to recognize and go, okay, this is in standard form. We don't want standard form. We want y equals mx plus b form. So let's convert it. So step 1, let's see if we remember what to do. Leave the y term, the -4y, leave that alone on this side. So we just leave it. Move the x over, so that's a 1x. Now it's going to be -1x. Okay, you can write the 1 in front or just leave it an x. Move the 12 over, that's positive 12. Well, now it's -12. All right, so that's step 1. The second step, and that's the final step, is to divide everything by whatever the coefficient of y is. So that's a -4. So divide each term by -4. All right, so when I do that, I get y equals, the two negatives here cancel to make a positive. I have 1/4 x. These two negatives also make a positive. 12 divided by 4 is 3. And again, this is one of those things I'm checking your lesson. Did you pay attention? I don't want decimals. I don't want you to submit decimals. All your answers should have fractions if they don't reduce. So that 1/4, leave it as a quarter. Okay, so there's our answer. That's the first thing. That's our standard, that's our y equals mx plus b form, right? Y equals mx plus b. So what's the m? The m is the 1/4. So my slope is 1 over 4. The b is 3. So my y-intercept coordinates would be 0, 3. All right, let's try and graph this thing. So first I'm going to start by graphing 0, 3. 0 over 3 up is right here. Now be careful because some of the instructions say to write the coordinates on the graph of the y-intercept. And same with our last lesson, right? Make sure you check what the instructions say. Read them through. 0, 3 are the coordinates of my y-intercept. Now, we need to graph using the slope. So slope, we have 3 formulas for it, but when we're on a graph, we always do rise over run. Now this is a positive slope, so it should be going up, right? I'm going to draw 2 lines here. One's positive slope, one's negative. That's a positive slope, that's a negative slope. Positive slopes go up from left to right, negative slopes go down from left to right. So this is positive, so we're going to go up 1 and over 4. Okay, so let's go to our graph and go up 1 over 1, 2, 3, 4 and put a point. There's another point. Go up 1, go over 1, 2, 3, 4. And we can keep going, but obviously this will go off the graph, so we won't worry about that. But you could go backwards. You can go backwards in your steps. Go backwards 4, down 1. Backwards 4, down 1. Backwards 1, 2, 3, 4, down 1. So I could find even more points. Go backwards 1, 2, 3, 4, down 1. Okay, so it's like a set of stairs, right? Now, our final answer, we don't want to have those stairs in though. So let's get rid of the stairs now. Let me get my eraser here. Just get rid of these stairs. Oops, I erased my point by accident. I'll write them back in here. Oh, great. I erased them both. All right, where was that guy? Here, and this guy was here. All right, then take your ruler, draw a really neat line, do the neatest job you can, okay? And then don't forget to put arrows on the end of your line. And if you're graphing more than one line on a graph, label the equation. So these are the little things we're looking for. Did you put arrows? Does your line go all the way through the graph? We've been doing this for months, right? All the way through the graph, beyond the grid, arrows on the end, and label it. So let's label it. We can use this one or the original, but since they gave us the original, I'm going to just label it the original line, which is x minus 4y plus 12 equals 0. Okay, so we took an equation standard form, we converted it to slope y-intercept form, we found the slope, we found the coordinates of the y-intercept, and we graphed it. All right, so that's the end of lesson 1 for today. Make sure you do the reading, and because there's some extra reading to do, and the assignment number 2.